What's up, what's up, what's up? Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Theory and Theology. On this podcast, we talk about culture and religion and traditions and spirituality. Today, I was kind of having a topic on my mind this morning a little bit related to kind of like just thinking about history of religion. It's always kind of interesting to go back in time to the origins of things. It seems most religions have like a history in time where things weren't really written down. There seems to be like that gap between like when things started to be written down, or even if there were like oral traditions passed down, there seems to be like a point where before people were not writing things down. Like what I mean by that is a lot of times in religions, and I'm not saying this is bad or good or whatever, but a lot of times in religions, the initial information, like I guess if you're going chronologically, there's oftentimes something about like how the humans came to be, or how that first group of people came to be where they are, and how the religion kind of began or started. There's usually a gap between that. Like usually it's like a history of the beginning, and then a time period where it's like those first people who were of that religion, whether they were visited by God or gods, or some kind of beings, and were kind of being taught about the religion or told like what to do. There's kind of like that first encounter that either happens near creation or happens later when the people get contacted. But one thing I've noticed is that oftentimes the religions don't really start like somebody was there at the very start when they were being created, documenting their experience of I was created near this time, or like this is what happened to like even like my father or grandfather, like somebody who was like alive to actually get like witness accounts of what happened during creation or the beginning of their lives, and then going from creation to usually it kind of jumps to a point where the people started learning, and then somewhere down the line the information gets written down kind of retroactively, kind of like they go back and they start talking about creation, or they go back and they start talking about when the first contact happened, and kind of what that group or culture of people were doing before they got contacted, kind of like a contrast of like before and after contact, or before, during, and after contact. And then the books tend to kind of like continue after after they've been contacted and gained some kind of information or knowledge, or like something along those lines. So I've kind of noticed that with religions, and I always find it kind of interesting. Like I know in Western culture, a lot of times we kind of place a lot of stake in written history, and so even though we know that it's not always fully the most accurate thing, for some reason we tend to trust it more than like oral traditions of like passing down information, even though it appears that a lot of cultures, before they started writing things down, there seems to have been an oral tradition before. And then also kind of like how religions kind of evolve, like from the very early stages of how things looked when people were first getting contacted and how things are now, in the current age, just how religion has changed, adapted. I'm talking just about every religion kind of follows kind of this kind of method. I mean, some religions, they're a little bit different. I'd say things that like sprout out of other things, like Christianity is a little bit different. Islam is a little bit different, because they kind of sprung out of Judaism, and so the Judaism, the Jewish history was really the history of Christianity and Islam. And then, once it started to become, a different religion or a different path, it's like once it starts to become a different path, it seems to become excuse me, I'm yawning. It kind of just creates like a different path eventually, and then they go to like some other direction and some other beliefs or some updates to the old belief systems, and seeing like what wasn't going well, and then these prophets or whoever it was were sent to kind of like put people back on a different path or lead people towards a different path. And then people followed those teachings. But I just find it interesting because, I know in Western culture, we're very like, okay, well, nobody was writing about this like earlier on. So even like the history of like written text, even if it's not like religious text, but just like having like alphabets and like written symbols and things like that, it seems like those systems came like after humans had already been on Earth for like a while. So it's kind of hard to know what was actually going on between humans being on Earth and the point in time where people started writing things down, depending on the culture too, because different cultures started writing things at different times. And I know even now, not every single culture has like a written language, or values, kind of like written, text and things like that, like, and that's fine, but I just notice, how much stake we kind of place in like the written information, and then like the oral traditions, or like the knowledge that's kind of verbally passed down. It's just kind of interesting to me. I was kind of thinking about that today. I was like, things kind of started at a certain place, and then they kind of went to another direction. They went in some direction that, someone else preferred. Or there was like an explanation created by, people of something that they learned that was passed down to them. And so they wrote it down, and that's how we have access to, learning, is through the written information. Usually you can find it on the internet or whatever, and like the written information. Another thing that I find interesting is that a lot of religions, so there is this kind of like original text that languages were written in. That religion's texts were written in, and the original text isn't always like in a language that like every single person really knows. Like, for example, in Judaism, Hebrew or even Aramaic, not a lot of people know it. Like, they don't all know it. There are some religions that really do place a lot of value in they place a lot of value in other in like people being taught how to read the language, the Hebrew language, like even at a very basic level. But I would say in Judaism, most, from what I understand, most people are like expected to learn Hebrew. They learn Hebrew, how to read it, how to write it. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody understands it, but they're able to read and write it, and then understand a translation in their own native language of what it means. And you'll see that a lot at like a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah. Like they're kind of like chanting from the actual original texts, with the prayers and the scriptures and things like that. And I think like in Islam it's kind of the same way with with Arabic, and also in Christianity. I would say with Catholicism, I've heard of people having to learn Latin, like when they went to school and stuff, because some of the services have a lot of base in Latin and the Latin language, but it's not necessarily the original text that everything was written in, but there is some, value placed on learning Latin. And so, I was just kind of thinking about that, about like kind of like language and written text and, verbal, traditions of passing down information, and then kind of like just in general, kind of like what's actually, who's actually connected to that. I think there is a lot of value in knowing like an original language of text, because you start finding things that maybe your native language doesn't accurately translate, or you start like seeing things where you're like, like what might that mean? That means something a little, like, you don't just see it from your own perspective. You have to kind of know like another cultural kind of viewpoint, to be able to even do that. So like you have to know another cultural viewpoint, to be able to really fully understand like what is actually written there. And it kind of challenges your thinking, because you have to know what it actually means culturally, not just like the words that you translate into like maybe English or Spanish or whatever, and then you're just kind of like, this is what it says. But then it's like, okay, like reading it in the original, sometimes you'll notice certain terms where they'll be like, okay, this kind of literally means this, but in the culture it kind of meant like this other type of thing. Like for example, and I'm probably gonna get this wrong, but I think like in the original Hebrew there's I think in the book of Job, and I don't remember exactly, but I think there's a word that's like, I think bracha means blessed or blessing or something along those lines. And there's a verse where Job's wife makes a comment saying like, just curse God and die. And I think in some texts it says bless God versus curse God, and things like that, where you're just like, okay, like that's weird. Yeah, and there's like reasons behind why it would say something different. Culturally, according to certain traditions, they wouldn't want to put like curse God, even though people kind of knew that that's what it was kind of meaning, so just stuff like that. This kind of like, it seems like simple, or even something like how people think about the Genesis creation story, and you know, the explanation of like the days, like how things were made on the first day and the second day, is like, you know, in the Bible, in the Hebrew, it says Yom Echad, like the first day, or whatever, the second day, the third day, and then there's some kind of like debate about like, was it like a literal 24-hour day? Some people say that when it says like Yom Echad, it's like the first period of time. It doesn't necessarily mean a 24-hour day period. And the reason why, I mean, like when you think of it, it's like God created light and darkness on the first day. Light and darkness were created before the sun and the moon. And so it's like, well, how do you have actually like a literal day without the sun or the moon? Without like what are you counting as a day? Like according to how as humans track a day, you know, usually it's by, you know, a cycle, you know, the earth, you know, of the earth, you know, spinning on this axis, a full rotation around. But if there was no sun and moon, does it just mean that the earth spun around completely once? Or what? Like, what does that even mean? And so it's just like stuff like that where it's kind of like what? You know? But yeah, that was just kind of what I was thinking today. Just random thoughts. Nothing too organized. If I sound tired, it's because I'm freaking tired. I don't know why I woke up tired today, but that's just how today is. And I got a lot to do. I had a lot on my mind yesterday. I recorded a lot about it too. So yeah, I got a lot on my mind. Had a lot on my mind last night. It's still not fully resolved, and now I'm trying to like power through work, even though I've got like a lot that I'm kind of thinking about. So yeah, with that, I'm gonna log off, and thanks for listening.